Hello and welcome to episode 65 of Not Reserving Judgment, a podcast about the latest intrigues, triumphs, and outrages in Canadian constitutional law. I'm Josh Dehaas, counsel with the Canadian Constitution Foundation.
I'm Christine Van Geyn, the CCF's litigation director.
And I'm Joanna Baron, executive director of the CCF. In today's episode, I'll tell you about the arrest of Rebel News journalist Ezra Levant.
I'll tell you about Doug Ford's plan to rip out bike lanes in Toronto and how those injured by biking without bike lanes can't sue the government.
And we'll share our bad legal takes of the week, where we take a lighthearted look at some legal opinions that didn't quite land. But first, I'm going to walk you through the verdict against Pat King, one of the notorious Freedom Convoy organizers. So to refresh your memory, King was probably the most notorious convoy leader other than perhaps Tamara Lich and Chris Barber, who, by the way, faced similar charges. They still face them, in fact. They had a trial earlier this year, and the verdict apparently for that is coming down sometime in March. So King stands out for, having made some of the more extreme comments that the media, which was always reporting on this in a very balanced and fair way, famously said during the convoy. So he had at one point said that the only way this is going to end is with bullets. And he also said that Justin Trudeau was going to catch a bullet. And so those were big headlines at the time. He was arrested and charged on February 18th, 2022, and held in detention for 5 months, released under very strict conditions, including against use of social media. The bottom line from his verdict on last Friday, was that King was found guilty of mischief, counseling others to obstruct police, and 2 counts of disobeying court orders. And he was found not guilty on 3 counts, which were intimidation, 3 counts of intimidation, and not guilty on 1 count of obstructing police related to his own arrest. He'll be sentenced in January, and the Crown's asking for a significant sentence, probably more prison time. The defense is asking for 5 months' time served. I'll just walk you through the judge's reasoning here, and I don't actually have the decision in my hands yet, unfortunately, so this is based on live tweeting done by a journalist who goes by the Twitter handle RightBlend, and so I'll correct anything that I get wrong here next week if it's inaccurate, but I doubt that will be the case. So according to the judge, King was a leader in some of the worst nuisances associated with the trucker protests, including the frequent blowing of truck horns that terrorized Ottawa residents and caused lots of people sleepless nights, and the blockading of streets. And most of the evidence here came from social media posts that King made himself. He had a huge social media following and was constantly, live streaming and posting about the convoy. King arrived from Alberta on January 29th. So right from the beginning, he was there, and he, for weeks on end, encouraged protesters to hold the line regardless of the court order that was in place against, blockading and constantly laying on truck horns. So for the counseling mischief charge, the judge relied on a number of other convoy cases, including the recent Alberta case, the Crown and Pawlowski. So in Pawlowski, the Alberta Court of Appeal upheld a conviction of counseling mischief against a pastor who gave a speech in a saloon encouraging the ongoing blockading of the highway crossing at Coutts. Pawlowski had told protesters that the whole world was watching them. He said, "Don't lose your momentum." He said they had the power, don't give it away, and told them to, quote, hold the line. And that speech was given at a time when the accused knew protesters nearby were interfering with the lawful use of the highway, so he was guilty of counseling mischief. And the judge pointed out here in King's case that, it was very similar language used, a very similar situation. There were lots of videos where King was saying things like, "We're not moving, we're not leaving." It was obvious that he knew about the injunction by February 7th of 2022. And yet he continued saying things like, "It's pretty hilarious that people haven't been able to sleep for 10 days. Hold the line. Truckers, do not move, do not leave, do not back out, do not leave residential areas, stand your ground, hold the line," etc. So importantly, and I think this will matter at sentencing, the judge says that King's frequent hold the line requests were usually accompanied with warnings to avoid violence. And so while he was found guilty of counseling mischief, it might be on the less serious end. The fact that he had alluded to violence a couple times in his live stream was not really relevant here, and I think that's correct based on the context of how he was saying those particular things. The judge said that in the court's view, there was overwhelming evidence that King planned to cause gridlock and occupy the area and cause disturbances for a lengthy period of time. And so, he was guilty of both the mischief and the counseling mischief. He also found that the evidence didn't support that he obstructed or resisted police, and that makes sense because the officer that testified didn't really think that had happened. And unsurprisingly, the judge found that he disobeyed the court order against the illegal aspects of the convoy. And the judge pointed out he actually expressed glee that people couldn't sleep and kept encouraging other people to keep honking. And it's very serious stuff to disobey court orders, so I wouldn't be surprised if that conviction, lands him a little bit more jail time. Interestingly, and surprisingly to me, the judge found that King did not commit criminal intimidation. Section 423(1)(g) of the Criminal Code says, everyone is guilty of an indictable offense who wrongfully and without lawful authority for the purpose of compelling another person to abstain from doing anything that he or she has a lawful right to do, or to do anything that he or she has a lawful right to abstain from doing, including blocks or obstructs a highway, is intimidation. And you would have thought that that charge would have been made out here, considering that the judge, King, caused mischief in part by blockading highways. But the judge apparently said that he had reasonable doubt that the convoy had tried to intimidate anyone to abstain from doing anything they had a right to do, including using the highway. And his reasoning was apparently that they were attempting to apply pressure and inconvenience and annoy people, not to intimidate them, and that this was a way of pressuring the government, which is not a person and cannot be intimidated. And the judge also said that 423(1) requires purposefully compelling someone to do or not do something he or she has a right to do, and this was not made out. So according to the judge, obstructing a highway in an otherwise lawful demonstration is not intimidation. Very interesting stuff. Joanna, keeping in mind that we haven't read the whole decision yet, that this is based on, secondhand reporting, the intimidation finding is still a pretty big head scratcher for me. Based on what's reported here, do you think the judge got that right? Do you have anything to say about that aspect?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I get the sense that the judge was kind of trying to split the baby, and it led to some findings that I think are odd and not entirely supported by the evidence. Like, it seems like he was, like, the evidence does support that finding. But as for the issue of blockading and the blockading being charter protected conduct, that seems highly odd to me. Our position has been that, yes, peaceful protests, marching, chanting, leaving aside the issue of disturbing people's sleep, which there was a separate injunction for. That's covered by a peaceful assembly and the right to free expression, but blockading isn't. And that's been our position throughout with everything that happened since the Freedom Convoy, since October 7th. So some weird findings. I guess we don't have the full official transcript, and we haven't seen all of the evidence. We obviously didn't watch the full trial, but I'm not really sure what's going on here. What do you think, Christine?
The only thing I can think of related to intimidation is maybe there needed to be more evidence related to a specific individual that was the aim of the intimidation, or there needed to be more specificity. And like you, I obviously didn't watch the proceedings. I didn't read the decision at this point. We don't have it. But that's kind of the only thing I can think of, is that perhaps there needed to be more specificity, that something needed to be more targeted to one specific individual that they're aiming to intimidate, or group of individuals they're trying to intimidate. And these are criminal cases. You need to make out all of the details of these charges in order to have a successful conviction. So that's the only thing I can really think of, because I kind of align with you guys on my thoughts on this.
Yeah,
I'll
I
move
guess
now to
there is something that, well, like, yeah, this judge seems to be saying your mens rea was to intimidate government, even though your
Mhm.
means of choosing to do that was just like annoying and intimidating anyone within earshot in downtown Ottawa. So maybe there's something there, but that seems to me that to be like he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I watched the Public Order Emergency Commission inquiry. Obviously, I watched the entire thing, and there were certainly reports of individual acts where some people were, citizens of Ottawa were like living their life, felt intimidated, or they were yelled at as they walked down the street wearing a mask. Protesters would yell at them. There were incidents like that. So perhaps to make out the charge against King on intimidation, they would have needed to show evidence that he was doing those specific things to specific people, and perhaps they just weren't able to make it out. So I'll turn to my news headline, which is about, I think, Josh's favorite topic, which is bike lanes. So for those of you who are listening who don't live in Toronto, there's sort of this culture war issue about bike lanes in this city. I think it might be happening in other cities as well, but it's certainly in Toronto. And Josh and I are on opposite sides of this culture war because Josh hates bike lanes. I actually biked over to his house last week to drop off a copy of our new book for him to review. It's a book about free speech that will be available on Amazon very shortly. And I biked there in part to enrage him, but in part because traffic in this city is notoriously bad, and it has been getting worse. There was a story recently actually about how the Utah Hockey Club had to walk to Scotiabank Arena for their game against the Leafs because the traffic was so bad that they were not going to make it on time if they stayed in their hockey club bus. So with traffic so bad already, I choose to bike, but a lot of people they don't bike, and so they're pretty mad when a major road is removed in order to install a bike lane. And this happened very close to my house, I think close to Josh's house as well, which is why he's so enraged. I live near a major road, Bloor Street, and this summer they took out a lane of traffic and put in a bike lane. So honestly, I didn't need them to do this. I was already biking downtown using side streets and the lakeshore because it's kind of pleasant. It's nice to bike along the lake, and also it felt safer because then I don't need to battle against traffic. So look, when they initially installed these bike lanes near my house, I was like, I don't need this. I wasn't into it. It did mess up traffic. I have to drive, especially to, take my kids to their various activities. And I already had this route downtown. And I feel bad for the businesses who are affected by the sudden change, which it felt like there was no consultation about it. Because now people avoid Bloor Street because of the bad traffic. And so they're avoiding the businesses that are on Bloor Street. But then I kind of changed my mind because I started using these bike lanes, and it is faster to get downtown using the Bloor route versus my old route. And it's pretty luxurious because nobody else uses these bike lanes. I'm like the only one there. I've got this whole bike lane just for myself. And, if the government is going to spend millions of dollars on infrastructure basically for my exclusive use, it would just be ungrateful to complain about it. So now I am a secret bike lane lover. Sorry, Josh. And don't tell my neighbors because, they all hate the bike lanes because it's really disruptive. So you might be wondering what the legal angle is in this diatribe I'm doing about bike lanes. Part of it is just to make Josh mad. But the other thing is that Doug Ford has recently announced that he is going to order these bike lanes to be removed. He's introduced a piece of legislation that will tear out this new bike lane near my house, as well as a couple of others. And the new law will require that if a city wants to install a bike lane that removes a lane of traffic, in the future, they're going to need provincial approval. And look, the province does have the power to do this. They can absolutely legislate on this issue. And Doug Ford actually lives in my neighborhood as well. I'm just gonna, wager a guess that he's not a cyclist, so he does not use these bike lanes. And he lives here. These bike lanes are unpopular. People are mad about them. They are 100% going to support tearing out these bike lanes, and 100% tearing them out is going to get Doug Ford votes in Etobicoke. I'm going to miss the bike lane, but I did already have this other route. But the issue is that cyclists are killed every year by vehicles, and you kind of see this all around town. You'll see these. They're called ghost bikes, and they're painted white. They have flowers on them, and they mark the site of a cyclist who was killed. And there was a particularly terrible incident a few months ago where a young woman was killed by a construction truck at Blue Run Avenue. She was trying to use the bike lane, but there was construction blocking the bike lane improperly, and she was forced into the road and killed. Okay, I need some help here. There is a provision in Bill 212 that says no cause of action against the Crown. It's in section 195.10 that said there's no cause of action against the Crown. In subsection, it says for DI, the removal of a bike lane or part of a bike lane. But the issue is, as far as I always understood, there's already broad Crown immunity. So perhaps this is unnecessary. Josh, maybe you can add a little bit to that. I know you used to work for the Attorney General, so you might be able to, inform us about how Crown immunity actually works in situations like this. But as far as I know, there's not like an affirmative, positive right to a bike lane.
Yeah, so many thoughts on this. So, I worked briefly for the Crown, as you know, and what you learn is that historically you couldn't sue the Crown at all, right? Like policy decisions were policy decisions. And then people thought that was wrong, and they decided to start putting in statutes that would allow people to sue where the Crown is negligent. The first one, I believe, is called the Proceedings Against the Crown Act, PACA, and then it was replaced a few years ago by the Ford government saying, like, look, municipalities are getting sued all the time over people tobogganing in parks, and this has resulted in municipalities banning people from tobogganing in parks because there's some, exposure to tort damages here, and so we're going to tighten this up. But the courts actually didn't uphold that, some of the decisions made under that act, and they've been really resistant to it because I guess they think you should still be able to sue. And also, where there's bad faith, the government still allows tort damages. So I think that, somebody could make some class action argument that there's bad faith here, and then the government would be, forced to settle for a very large amount of money. And that's ridiculous for the reasons you point out. And, we didn't have these bike lanes on places like Bloor and University Avenue, these big streets downtown before, and you couldn't sue for not having a bike lane. So why would you be able to sue for having that now? And, to be honest, like, I'm not totally against bike lanes. I think where there's enough demand for them, that it's perfectly reasonable for cyclists to take up that road space. So let's say, downtown, 10% of people really do want that option, and they're going to use it, then they should have at least 10% of road space, maybe even a little bit more, like, to be reasonable. But what happened in Toronto is overnight during the pandemic, they said, let's just take this opportunity when nobody's driving to just force bike lanes everywhere on all of the big streets. And everybody ends up who drives, and people are forced to drive, they get stuck in traffic. And, university, I saw this happen. It's where all the hospitals are, and I had to drive an elderly relative to regular hospital appointments. And it went from being able to drive there in X amount of time to being able to drive there and getting stuck for like cycle after cycle after cycle at the same light, trying to turn into the hospital because there's now one lane for traffic instead of two or three that there were before. So, imagine that you're in an ambulance trying to get through that. And if you've been on Yonge Street where there are now bike lanes, you see, ambulances getting stuck all the time. So we got to be reasonable about these things. And the city of Toronto wasn't. It went too far. And so I don't have a problem with the province stepping in when Toronto goes too far. Yeah. So anyway, legally, policy, I think this nothing wrong with this particular act as far as I'm aware, and I'm not totally against bike lanes. I want you to have them where it makes sense. Anyway, Joanna, you're one of these downtown pinko cyclist lefties who rides your bike everywhere, aren't you? So what do you
I
think?
mean, I'm not as hardcore as Christine. Like, I just ride the bike share bikes because it is genuinely the fastest way to get around the downtown core. Like, I live in sort of the north end of the downtown core, and just like if I need to get to the financial district, it's like hands down. But by the way, the thing on Sunday with the Utah hockey team, I know this was circulated as like rage bait. I actually knew this firsthand because I was trying to get from my place. I was driving, bad idea, but I don't know. I had to get somewhere else. And I was driving downtown to meet a friend. And I literally called my friend and was like, I cannot get downtown. But that was because it was the Santa Claus parade and like King Street was closed, Adelaide was closed, Richmond was closed. Like I couldn't turn anywhere. I was just like, I can't get to Queen West. I'm sorry. So that was like not a normal Toronto traffic situation on Sunday. Otherwise, I do agree that yes, even if the government considered this and considered the possibility of the impacts on cyclists, that doesn't mean that you can sue the government for negligence in some eventuality. The case with the girl at Blorin Avenue was really sad, and it hit home because that's like literally a route that I bike down on the bike lane constantly. And then the last thing that I want to say, this is kind of funny. This acquaintance of mine that I knew through a clerking friend back in the day has now branded himself as the biking lawyer. Have you guys seen
I
this
know
guy?
him. I went to law school with him.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about him a bit offline. But anyways, his name is Dave Shellnut, and I'm just looking at his Twitter that he is organizing a critical mass Time to Fight Back rally, High Park, this Friday. So I would avoid, for any of you in Toronto, in the West End of Toronto, avoid High Park. And he says, take our lanes, we'll take yours. Um,
Oh,
so uh, so yeah, so good for him, milking this opportunity for all that it's worth,
hey, you
and
got to market your practice.
taking the rage bait.
Yeah, nothing will convince people like blocking traffic even more
Yeah,
to
exactly.
like
Nothing will make
cyclists.
you, yeah, sympathetic to people who want to do the environmentally friendly thing and bike, which I totally support. Okay, let's take a break, and then when we come back, I will tell you about what happened with Ezra Levant on Sunday in a different part of Toronto. Okay, so Ezra Levant, who is a journalist, political commentator, overall gadfly, claims that he is planning to sue the Toronto police for arresting him for filming an anti-Israel protest in Toronto on Sunday. So Levant wasn't charged, but he claims that the police breached his charter rights and refused to protect him. So I'll tell you what happened. I have watched a few videos at this point of this incident. So in the video of his interaction with the police, which you can also watch on X, it's been posted by Rebel News, the police can be heard urging Levant to move away from the protest, which was happening at Bathurst and Shepherd, which is a very heavily Jewish neighborhood. And by the way, as a sidebar, I looked a little bit and I didn't see the normal, like plausible deniability that the protest was just blatantly targeting Jews. Like it's very far from any type of embassy, Canadian embassy, Israeli embassy. This is an area that is noted for Kiva's Bagel Shop, Mo Panzer's Deli, the biggest Jewish community center, JCC, just up the road at Bathurst and Shepherd. So I don't think there's even any pretext that this was we just decided to wake up on a Sunday morning and go harass some Jews. And I'll tell you a little bit at the end what exactly the protest consisted of. But anyways, they're having a protest. They're mostly pro-Palestine protesters. You see them walking along, I think, the sidewalk on Bathurst Street with the cops. The cops are escorting Levant. The crowd is chanting, "Get him out, get him out." Levant says that you're violating my charter rights. Then the officer can be heard accusing him of inciting the crowd. He says, "You're inciting." And Levant says, "I haven't incited anything. I'm just here watching and filming and documenting this protest." Then another officer, who appears to be the officer in charge, tells Levant, "Look, just cross the road, go to the other side of Bathurst, where there was a small group of pro-Israel counter-protesters. And Levant refuses. He says, why? I have every right to be here. I have my selfie stick, my camera. I just want to film. And so the officer says, you know what? That's it. He's fed up. He says, I'm arresting you for breaching the peace. The protesters immediately cheer, and you see that they're carrying signs, some of which says the Palestinian Holocaust. One protester says, stop terrorizing, a peaceful protest. Not entirely sure about that. And Ezra is debating this. He's with the cop. He's saying, what am I doing that's incitement? And the police says, just your presence is incitement. And Ezra argues and says, you're keeping me away because I'm a Jew in my hometown and I'm your boss as a Canadian citizen. You answer to the law of the charter. But anyways, he's arrested. He's not charged. And the protest, by the way, if you didn't see it, part of it included somebody cosplaying as Yahya Sinwar, the deceased Hamas terrorist leader. He's sitting in a chair that is meant to evoke the chair that Sinwar was sitting in during his final moments. There were plenty of inverted red triangles, which is the Hamas target symbol. And I found this the creepiest. There were people who had signs that just said free flights to Amsterdam. So yeah, really lovely protest. But let's talk a little bit about whether this arrest was justified. So this brings to mind a case that came out of the Supreme Court that the CCF actually intervened in 2019 called Fleming. So Randy Fleming was arrested by the police while he was on his way to a counter-protest against an Indigenous occupation of the Douglas Creek Estates, which is in Caledonia, Ontario. He was carrying a Canadian flag, walking on the shoulder of a highway when unmarked police vehicles, presumably identifying him as a counter-protest, drove directly at him. He left the shoulder of the road to avoid being hit by the cars. And incidentally, he entered the estates. Once he did so, a number of Indigenous occupiers began to approach him, and the police said they relied on their authority under common law to respond by restraining and arresting Fleming so as to prevent the possibility of a violent confrontation. And the court says, in their decision, the Supreme Court of Canada unanimously found there's no common law power to arrest someone who is acting lawfully in order to prevent an apprehended breach of the peace, and found that in this case, the officers did not have legal authority to arrest Mr. Fleming. The court said that the government was relying on a common law power to arrest someone who is acting lawfully in order to prevent an apprehended breach, which is a power that I have found to be non-existent. And in the decision below of the Ontario Court of Appeal, Justice Huscroft made a comment that I agree with, which is that police efforts should be directed towards those who would threaten violence, not those exercising their constitutionally protected rights to protest peacefully. And we know from the criminal code that cops are explicitly empowered to make preventative arrests in other contexts, like where there's reasonable grounds to believe that the person is about to commit an indictable offense. But police have to have some more specified or witnessed evidence before they do that. So, you know, prior restraints have their place in the criminal law. But potential speculative future breach of the peace is not one of them. And so look, I watched the video. I don't think that these cops are evil anti-Semites. They're clearly just like guys in their 60s on a Sunday morning, just like, look, dude, you're Ezra Levant. We know who you are. We know you're the S disturber. Like, just like, please cross the road and make our job a little bit easier this morning. We know that this is not going to go well. But I'm sorry, like that's not a thing. If Ezra showed up and he started doing something and he started getting into people's faces and started, you know, shouting expletives, that's a different case. But from what we know, and granted, I didn't see everything that Levant did in face of the protesters, but certainly the cops just said, you're here and you're inciting. So there could be some part of what happened that we're not aware of. But from what I saw, no, you can't arrest someone just because they show up and want to film or observe a public a publicly occurring protest. And it doesn't really, help the credibility of the police at this particular moment when you have a group of people who are literally showing up in a Jewish neighborhood, invoking pogroms and I guess lionizing a terrorist leader, that they are being protected, and the serious tactics come out with somebody who is documenting it. But I don't know, I could be missing something here. I don't think that Levant's lawsuit against the cops is likely to go very far, but not an encouraging incident. Josh, what do you think? Did you watch this video?
Yeah, I watched the video. I'm really angry and annoyed about this because we're over a year into these frequent protests, and there are always going to be people that go and, thank God, document what's happening. Like, if Mississauga Mayor Carolyn Parrish is there dressed as Yahya Sinwar. Oh, that's a joke. If people are there dressed as Yahya Sinwar, or they have, anti-Semitic comments, we need to know, and that needs to be documented. And the mainstream media is not doing that. So you have alternative media that is very, right-wing doing that. You have Karam Assad doing that, and they have every right to be there to document that, and they have a right to be there to counter protest and to try and engage and talk with the other protesters. And police in Toronto seem to be just under the impression that nobody's constitutional rights matter here except for the pro-Palestinian protests, and that's not right. And we have a Supreme Court decision that says, albeit in obiter, that provocateurs, and that's what some people consider Ezra Levant to be, they have a right to be protected and engage in their free expression and their liberty, and they have a right to be there. And this cop that you see in the video, his name I think is McDuff, if I'm not mistaken, he doesn't seem to understand anything about the law here. And I think Ezra Levant should win this, unless the judge says it's moot or something like that. I think he should win this, and I think it's astonishing that this McDuff guy just seems to know so little about the law. This is not the only video where that guy is shown talking to someone and essentially trying to intimidate them away from covering the protest or counter protesting, and he doesn't even know the basics of like who's who at the protest, or understand the fact that this is, a lot of pro-terrorist people there that are probably have direct support from some sort of terrorist groups. Like, anyway, this whole thing makes me mad. So whatever you think of Ezra Levant, if you think he is, a provocateur, a journalist, whatever, he had every right to be there. And yeah, it makes me really mad. Christine, what do you think?
Unless there's, I mean, right now, all we know is kind of what's based on the videos. And based on the videos, it just looks very similar to the Fleming scenario. I would say, look, I know a lot of people are tired of seeing the people on every side of this issue protesting. They're tired of the coverage of this. They think that these groups rile each other up, and they absolutely do, of course. But think about how important it is that we actually know what happened at that protest among that pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel group. If there had not been counter protesters there filming this, we would have no idea that these anti-Israel protesters are cosplaying Yahya Sinwar, sitting in a chair pretending to be him, glorifying a literal terrorist. We would have no idea about the anti-Semitic signs saying "Go back to Amsterdam." We would have no idea there were protesters there with red triangles caressing them. So you can say, I'm sick of these people riling each other up, but if you didn't have them there to counteract these disgusting acts by these anti-Israel protesters, we wouldn't really understand what's motivating them, which seems to be a love of terrorism based on those three acts, or a hatred of Jews. So, I mean, it's really important that people like Ezra are there documenting that. That's all I will say. So let's turn now to our bad legal takes. And look, I think that my news headline this week actually could have been a bad legal take because of how silly this whole issue is. But so because I kind of already gave you a bad legal take, I'll kind of tell you a story about a weird legal issue that I read about. This is an issue from South Korea, and this is reported on by Canadian press. So in South Korea, there's mandatory conscription. All able-bodied men need to serve in the military for 18 to 21 months. Individuals who have health issues can do their military service at non-military facilities like community service centers, and that's obviously easier. So depending on what their medical issue, they can get that community service, or they can even be completely exempted. So one young man who was 26 years old, he did not want to do his military service, and his friend told him he could get out of it and go to one of these community placements if he was overweight. So the young man decided to intentionally gain weight. He gained 44 pounds by eating high calorie foods and basically doubling his daily food consumption. He also quit his job, I guess, so he could focus on eating. And before his physical exams, he also drank a lot of water, I guess, so he would weigh more. And he weighed in at 225 to 230 pounds. He was 5'6" and originally 183 pounds. So I searched to see if Canada has something like a maximum weight or BMI to join the military. I couldn't find anything. So if you're listening and you know the answer to that, let me know, because I'm kind of curious. So are you allowed to intentionally get fat to evade conscription in Korea? No. This man was convicted of deliberately gaining weight to evade military service, and he was sentenced to a year in prison and a suspended sentence of 2 years. I mean, in Canada, it seems like we don't put people in jail for violent crimes, let alone for gaining weight. So, and the friend who told him to gain weight, he got a suspended 1-year prison term. So what's the bad legal take? I guess the bad legal take goes to the guy who gained the weight and to the friend who advised them, because apparently, according to this Canadian press report, this isn't even an uncommon strategy. Like, a lot of people know about this. Every year, there are about 50 to 60 cases of dodging military service in North Korea, and gaining or losing excessive weight is one of the common ways that people dodge this conscription. So I think my bad legal take goes to the guy who got fat on purpose to avoid a year in the military, only to get a year in jail instead, when this tactic seems well known to Korean authorities. Joanna, what's your bad legal take this week?
So my bad legal take goes to the UN, which is refusing to renew the contract of Alice Warmio Nidarito, who is Kenyan, who is the UN's current special advisor on the prevention of genocide. She's an accomplished mediator. She has served in her role since 2020. She has been carefully studying instances of the worst crime humanity knows. And the Wall Street Journal, this is the Wall Street Journal's reporting, not mine. They are reporting that she's being dismissed because she has stood firm in her belief and reporting that Israel's war with Hamas isn't genocide. She has held that as a legal matter, establishing a pattern of violence as a genocide requires demonstrating intent, and that Israel's campaign of self-defense doesn't qualify. And the UN this month, it has a special committee to investigate Israeli practices, of course, many committees to study Israel. This month, that committee issued a report supporting accusations of genocide. The committee is led by Austrian named Volker Turk, who has spent the last year continually attacking Israel, and the committee is dominated by member states Malaysia, Senegal, and Sri Lanka, which are nations with a history of hostility to Israel. A UN spokesperson sent a statement to the Wall Street Journal saying that Alice Nidarito is leaving the UN as her contract is expiring, adding that genocide is strictly defined in international law, and any legal determination is made by appropriate judicial bodies. But the Secretary General, of course, has the authority to extend her contract, and the general practice is that UN contracts are renewed when their terms expire, leading us to the unavoidable conclusion that Ms. Nidarito's removal is a political choice and greatly undermines the already questionable legitimacy of the UN as an institution. Josh, what's your BLT?
Mine's a little bit lighter, I think. So mine goes to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, which is notorious for bad legal takes. Nothing new here. The tribunal has ordered that a pride group called Borderland Pride in Emo Township in northwestern Ontario be paid $15,000, with $10,000 coming from the township's taxpayers and $5,000 coming from the township's part-time mayor because council voted against declaring June Pride Month and decided not to display a rainbow flag. So Borderland Pride argued this was discrimination in services based on sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, creed, and family status, and apparently the adjudicator agreed. So here's what happened. In 2020, Borderland Pride asked the township to adopt or enact the attached resolution or proclamation declaring June Pride Month and affirming your community as a place of welcome, inclusion, and safety for LGBTQ2. Second, we ask your organization to fly or display an LGBTQ rainbow flag for a week of your choosing in the month of June. And it says pride flags have been distributed in previous years, but we can provide you with a new one if requested. So the township had actually issued a proclamation that Borderland had sent them in 2018 and again in 2019, although in 2019 they apparently issued a modified one, not the exact text that they had been sent. I don't actually know what it says, unfortunately. It's not in the reasons. Interestingly, and this is important, the decision says that both parties agreed that issuing proclamations was a service offered by the township. And that's important because you can only discriminate under the Human Rights Code if you're denying someone service. So the town resolution, but it didn't address flying the flag. It just didn't do it. And shortly before the vote on the resolution, the mayor, Harold McQuaker, said, quote, "There's no flag being flown for the other side. There's no flags being flown for straight people." And according to the adjudicator, this comment was discriminatory. It showed a lack of understanding of the importance to Borderland Pride and other members of the LGBTQ, I don't even know how to say that, community of the pride flag. And she wrote, "I find this remark was demeaning and disparaging of LGBTQ2, of which Borderland Pride is a member, and therefore it's discrimination under the code. Never mind that Borderland Pride is a corporation and that no individual resident from Emo stepped up to challenge us in any way." So the adjudicator goes on, "I infer from the close proximity of Mayor McQuaker's discriminatory remark to the vote on Borderland Pride's proclamation request that Borderland Pride's protected characteristics were at least a factor in his nay vote, and therefore it too constitutes discrimination under the code." As for damages, the adjudicator noted that an expert named Dr. Saywick presented evidence that there is a link between public or political figures making discriminatory statements and hate speech and significant harms. And this expert testified about research where 1,200 people in the US described how anti-LGBTQ rhetoric by President Trump, Vice President Pence, and members of Trump's cabinet during his presidency visibly increased the amount of hate and violence publicly expressed by others who were strongly affiliated with Trump's political views. Okay. So anyway, she also noted that the applicants gave evidence that many homophobic and hateful social media posts about Borderland Pride and the LGBTQ2 community appeared following the May 12th council meeting and vote, and that these were the result of discrimination. And so she awarded $15,000 for injury to dignity, feelings, and self-respect. And she ordered the mayor to attend human rights training within 30 days. Really weirdly, she denied a request that the township be ordered to proclaim June as Pride Month. And she said this was due to potential freedom of expression concerns. Okay, so the whole case was about freedom of expression, so it's really absurd that she found there was discrimination, but that she can't force them to order June to be Pride Month. I mean, councillors deciding whether to foist flags or issue proclamations are not providing a service. They're being asked to endorse a message on behalf of their constituents who elect them, and the message is the whole point. The townspeople and their representatives, if they don't support that message, maybe because they don't believe in flying the flags of individual minority groups, which I think is perfectly reasonable, why should they be compelled to proclaim something they don't believe in? You know, that's obviously compelled speech, and it's really, in my view, undemocratic to have some, unelected bureaucrat in Toronto demanding that some council in Northwestern Ontario make a proclamation that apparently they don't believe in. So, even if they're providing a service, why are the townspeople now on the hook for $10,000 when they did absolutely nothing wrong? I really don't know. So I just think this is a really bad decision all around. I hope to see it get challenged, and that's all I want to say about that. So, bad legal take, Ontario Human Rights Commission or Tribunal, and that's the end of the show. So, as usual, please rate us, review us, and subscribe. You can support our work by subscribing to the CCF's YouTube channel, by following us on Twitter, which I suppose is now called X, and by visiting our website, theccf.ca, where you can sign up for our new and improved Freedom Update newsletter. The CCF is a nonpartisan legal charity funded by your donations, so please click that donate button on our website if you can. Thanks for listening.